Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak on this motion that the official opposition brought, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on Policy 713, which I support. I expect there are a lot of people in the Premier's party who are wondering why he just didn't leave well enough alone. You know, when I first read Policy 713, I thought, how well this has been put together, how much thought must have gone into this. It was clear as a bell and hit the mark, in my opinion. And clearly, you can see years of effort went into drafting that policy to get it right. Years of effort, and it's been achieving its goals. The intent to keep safe and affirm queer and trans students in their schools. Because, you know, it's not a safe and affirming society yet, Mr. Speaker. Not. And that's why every year in the State of the Child report, when you review, as I do, the stats on the state of the child for different issues, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable when it comes to mental health and suicide rates and all kinds of parameters around social acceptance and how they view themselves and how they think other people view them are the trans and queer kids. Every year, most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And surely, one of the responsibilities of this legislature is to ensure that the most vulnerable of the vulnerable are protected. The first person who reached out to me after it became clear that 713 was going to go under review was a mom. Was a mom whose trans child some weeks before had attempted to take their life. This is what's been happening when we live in the society that we do, when the kind of hate that's been swirling around without the Premier pouring gasoline on it has that kind of effect. And he's been pouring gasoline on it. And I promised that mother right there, right then, that I would stand with her to ensure that her child will continue to be protected and have an affirming environment in their school. Education and Pride in Education has been working hard to provide teachers with professional development around the implementation of Policy 713. There's a guidebook that's, I think, sitting on the minister's desk that's been developed that hasn't been signed off on. And it's important to know, I mean, you hear the Premier and the Minister of Education talk about how they support this and that, but when it came to the professional development opportunities that Pride in Education were offering at Subject Council Day at Hanwell Academy, Premier ensured that the funding they usually receive for the kind of professional development opportunities they provide at Subject Council Days was denied. No funding. No funding. Staff that were supposed to appear there from the Department of Education were told they couldn't speak. So, Mr. Speaker, this goes far beyond what the Minister and the Premier have been talking about. The Leader of the Official Opposition raised a statement that was released by the New Brunswick Association of School Psychologists, and I too want to give a little more voice to it, because these are school psychologists, Mr. Speaker, and so they say they want to express their deep concern over the recent changes in 713 and the negative impacts these changes would have on transgendered and gender-diverse students in our province. They went on to say safe and affirming environments for 2S LGBTQIA+ students are critical for their mental health and well-being. Misgendering transgender and gender-diverse people increases risk of self-harm, suicidal ideation, and other mental concerns. And that's exactly what Policy 713 revisions will lead to, misgendering by teachers in the school environment. It's not going to provide the safe and supportive environment the Minister of Education claimed it would, because the misgendering will begin, which, as the psychologists say, will increase the risk of self-harm, suicidal ideation, and other mental health concerns. And as such, they say, it is imperative that students' names and pronouns be respected and used in the school environment regardless of their age. School psychologists will not be complicit in creating harm by misgendering the students with whom they work. They go on to say that the Association of School Psychologists understands the importance of parental support and involvement in the lives of children, as we all do. And school psychologists seek to educate, empower, and engage parents wherever possible. But they also recognize the realities and potential for harm, violence, homelessness, psychological distress imposed on queer and trans students who live in unsupportive home environments. Sure, there are a tiny minority of parents out there who would want to know so they could beat their kids straight. Try to in their minds. It's exactly what happens. I had a young trans student who's starting just their first year of university in my office the other day, who came to see me to tell me about their experience in school with 713 and before 713, and the difference it made. The difference it made for them in being able to reach out to their parents. Took a little time, but they got there. And he related the story of a friend of theirs who a particular teacher did not respect Policy 713 and called this student, other students' parents. What happened? He got kicked out of his house, from his father's house. Kicked out of his father's house. So these are exactly the things the school psychologists are talking about. Policy 713, they say, must prioritize the rights, safety, and well-being of the child when parental involvement would increase the risk of physical or psychological harm. And what 713 has been revised to do will not achieve that. They go on to say they're especially concerned with the plan to direct transgender and gender diverse students to mental health professionals like school psychologists or school social workers for help engaging their parents. And they say requiring students to see a professional in these situations, and this is what I thought too when I heard this, pathologizes gender identity, increasing stigma, and could lead children and youth to believe there's something wrong with them for trying to live authentically as themselves. So the interesting thing is 713's solution to engage parents through psychologists also ignores the legal and ethical responsibilities of those mental health professionals who require informed parental consent to work with children under the age of 16. It's no solution. They have to talk to the parents to just work with those students. So the process, they say, of seeking informed consent in these situations actually would result in the outing students to parents, which the Minister of Education keeps saying that's not what they're going to do. But that's exactly, according to the school psychologists, what they will be forced to do if students are directed to them, and they have to seek consent under 16 of the parents. Those students will be outed, potentially creating harm that the policy claims to be attempting to avoid. So, as they say, revisions to this policy place school psychologists and other school-based mental health professionals irreconcilably at odds between their employer, the ethical principles of their professions, and those they serve, which is why in the end they urge the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development to rescind changes in Policy 713. The Premier talks a lot about balancing rights. What about the rights of the parents? Well, it's important to articulate the public trust that the Minister of Education was talking about that actually requires the rights of parents to rank above the rights of the youths. Where is the evidence of that? Talking about balance here. So we need Policy 713, which clearly at the beginning was sufficiently protective of the rights of students, and the balance is to ensure that the rights of students are sufficiently protected when you're looking at the balance between the students' rights and the parents' rights. And the revisions to 713 undermine that balance. They've tipped the balance in the wrong direction, Mr. Speaker. So rather than creating an unsafe and less affirming environment in the schools, the Premier and the Minister of Education should be doing their very best to ensure that the important rights of students are protected, which they're not. And that any balancing that might be done is done in accordance with the best legal principles, of which we've heard none from this Premier or this Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker. I don't know, what it is with the Premier, but he's sowing chaos these days wherever he turns. And he keeps blaming it, including the opposition to his goal of revising 713, blaming it on others. This chaos is other people's fault, blaming opposition parties, blaming deputy ministers who no longer have their jobs, or assistant deputy ministers, or psychologists. Everyone but himself, but he's the one who's sowing the chaos, Mr. Speaker. It was like 18 months ago I first noticed a change. It seemed like he decided he was done with democracy. Done. And was going to get in the bulldozer and start pushing forward. And it wouldn't stop until he felt he was done, no matter the devastation he leaves in his wake. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. The fear that he's wreaked among students, parents, teachers, and the queer and trans community at large is inexcusable. Just look, Mr. Speaker, what's been happening online before this happened. That's the context. I was talking to a senior official not that long ago, who is probably around my age, who for the first time said, and they would be a member of the LGBTQ community, said for the first time in years they're feeling that old fear in the pit of their stomach that hasn't been there since, I don't know, the 90s, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's a common experience right down to the kids. Right down to the kids. So, Mr. Speaker, the Premier keeps talking about wanting to keep the ball rolling, keep moving forward. But he's moving forward in the wrong direction. He's moving forward in ways that trample the safety and security of queer and trans kids in the schools, and the teachers, and bulldozing over the parents of those students who fear for their safety and for their well-being and for how they might end up getting treated in school when, as the Minister of Education said, sometimes kids can be cruel. Well, what kind of message has this sent to those kids in their schools when the circle of friends around an individual student who may be queer or trans are supporting them and, not using their appropriate gender and so on and name, and the teachers do not? And then that opens the door for other students to say, well, open season for the bullies. Open season for the bullies from the biggest bully in the province. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that this amendment was brought forward and that we have a chance to vote on it. I would just say that, of course, this legislature doesn't have to urge the government to ask the Commissioner the legislative officer to do a certain thing because the legislative officer is an officer of this legislature, and it's the legislature that actually makes the request. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Restigouche-Charlotte.